table at any rate. We've got the drawing in there, and now I'm going to start knocking the background back and bringing the figures forward. And I'm going to do that with just a nice wash of color. One of the things that we're doing is we're dealing with dimension. And I'm just going to do this so that I can block out what's in here. So that now we can actually see that there's space between this head and this head, instead of it all just sort of running together. I mix my paint in cups because I want to have enough paint that I can come back and back and back on it without it drying out, without having to recreate it. So part of what that means is then I test the color, the amount of pigment versus medium, the opacity versus the translucence, the brightness in this case of the blue, the tone, etc., on the canvas itself. And so I get a pretty good sense, because it's all based out of the same blue. I'm able to play with things not all that dissimilar than you would with a tone sheet, where you go from the darkest to the lightest, all keeping with the same basic paint. So, and you can see it's the same blue but considerably darker. What I've just done here is I've done the equivalent of adding more flour to my gravy, but in this case it's more of the pigment. And look at that, now it's starting to get something. That's better. All right, now, I think that a drawing is about line, and I think a painting is about shapes. Now, not to use a bad pun, but the two things do tend to cross the lines. Now watch what happens here. This is going to make this shape a lot more dynamic, I think. There we go. So now as I do this, let's talk a little bit about this idea of the puzzle. So I think that there's some important things about doing a painting like puzzle pieces. The first part of it is that, to me, as a painter, the thing that keeps me interested, that gives a painting its dynamism, is solving mysteries inside of the composition. You know, the discrepancy between this wash of blue, that more opaque version, and then this much darker, much more opaque version, is really setting up something which is sort of dynamic. So each of these shapes, we're going to take a little bit of the color from each of them, and it's going to create a steady background which will recede. So we're going to end up with this thing that has a little texture, some hints of the shadows and the shapes that were in there, where some of it is darker and some of it is lighter, and you'll see we'll come and pick up little bits of pigment from the darker shapes and then mix it in here. I like the use of the brush stroke here as a device that you can still see. You can see that where the lighter shapes were, that's what's dominant, and where the darker shapes are, that it sort of works its way down back into the darkness. Now these guys start coming forward and this starts going back, because of course there is a recipe to the way that you execute this kind of thing. It's just having to do with the medium itself, as in, you know, there's certain rules that apply just because the paint only does certain kinds of things. So I'm going to do something very dramatic, and it's likely to, first of all, the whole color will change. The whole feel of it will change. It'll get considerably darker, and I'm going to do it by adding red. So this is sopping wet on the canvas, so what we're going to end up with is something which is like this. It's going to be almost more of a purple. And then I'm going to come back onto it with a different kind of brush. And I'm going to scumble all of this in so that it creates a smooth veneer. It's like walking down a path in the forest. You know that you're going to come out of the trees at some point, but you don't know exactly how or where. You know what path you're walking on, but you don't know where it comes out of the forest. So to me, the light blue was not appropriate to the subject matter here, whereas this deep purpley burgundy red is much more appropriate to the feel of the dinner party. Okay. Give me a little black, a little blick. Like the New Zealand All Blacks. So let's start with the black. Okay. So let's start this way. Now we're talking. In many ways, this is why people start to talk about painting as being sculptural, because you're really working the paint. So. That's a weird fella. The nice thing about oil paint is that it's all about layers.